state takeovers of public schools. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. This is hosted by the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, the Center for Popular Democracy, and the Southern Education Foundation. So a couple of quick housekeeping items before we jump into our agenda for the next hour. First thing is that all attendees are on mute for the whole webinar. If you have a burning question as we go along, please type it in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom right of your screen, and we'll collect them as we go and answer them at the end. You'll also have the opportunity at the end of our agenda to ask questions by using the raise the hand function, which is just above the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. But feel free to type questions along the way in the Q&A box. Second, we'll also be recording the webinar, and we'll share the link to the recording with all participants so that you can share with others who might have missed, and we'll be sure to share the resources discussed during this webinar as well. So our agenda for the next hour is to discuss the facts about state takeovers of public schools, an issue that each of the host organizations on this webinar has researched and released reports on over the last year. Those reports on this webinar come at a time when a quickly growing number of states have passed or are considering legislation that creates state-run school districts that are empowered to seize control of individual low-performing schools. These districts are often called achievement school districts or opportunity school districts, and they're touted as a way to improve student academic outcomes. These state-run districts are currently in place in 3 states, Louisiana, Michigan, and Tennessee. And the evidence from those existing state-run districts show that they have actually not improved academic outcomes for most students. Instead, they have served as a mechanism for wholesale conversion of public schools to charters, and they've disenfranchised tens of thousands of Black and Latino communities. As organizations fighting for education justice for students of color and low-income students in this country, we wanted to address 2 questions with our research and now with this webinar today. The first is, what does the evidence say about how well state takeover districts do in providing opportunities to learn to students? And the second is, what does the evidence say about supporting struggling schools? Is there a better way to build the schools our students deserve? So to help us answer these questions over the next hour, we'll hear from Karan Blair, who's the director of the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, on how state takeovers have disenfranchised communities of color in the states in which they've operated. Kyle Surratt, the director of Education Justice Campaigns at the Center for Popular Democracy, will talk about the evidence on academic outcomes for students in state takeover districts. And finally, Kim Zarafis, who's the president of Education Austin, a merged local of AFT and NEA in the Austin Independent School District, who's also a former classroom teacher of 12 years, will discuss strategies that are proven to work in transforming struggling schools. After Kim, we will open it up for questions and answers. So a quick overview of how state takeovers operate and what we mean by state takeover districts in the context of the research reviewed on this webinar. Under a state takeover district, the designated state agency is typically empowered to take control of individual schools anywhere in the state, can create an arbitrary criteria for eligibility based on test scores. This is usually either created by the state agency or by the legislature. They can remove the school from local jurisdiction and place it in a state school district. The law may or may not outline conditions for a return to local control, and the law usually allows several interventions in the schools. This particular form of state takeover district currently exists in several states. Again, Louisiana, the Recovery School District, which was created in 2003, Tennessee with the Achievement School District, Michigan with its Education Achievement Authority, and most recently Nevada with an Achievement School District. However, state takeovers are playing out in similar but slightly different ways across the country, including when states are empowered to take over entire school districts or school boards. Similar issues are at stake in those state takeovers as well. So it's been 13 years since the creation of the Recovery School District in Louisiana. Tennessee followed suit in 2010 and Michigan in 2013, and those three states are the states where most of the evidence in the research reviewed on this webinar come from. In Nevada, legislation was enacted last year and mandates that all schools put in the takeover districts be turned over to charter operators. Georgia will face this question on the ballot this November of whether the state constitution should be amended to allow for state takeover. And similar legislation is now proposed or pending in a number of other states, including Mississippi, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So what do we know from the three states that have been operating state takeover districts? We'll go to Karan Blair first from the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. One second while we pass the slides over to Karan. Thanks.
Awesome. Last year in August, under the leadership of Lee Dingerson, the Alliance released a report that documented the impact of these takeovers. And one of the central claims, I'm trying to make sure that this is working. I'm not sure I have control, Catherine, just so you know. One of the central claims of the report really sort of speaks to the racial impact of the takeovers. Right, so under the current takeover project, tens of thousands of students are in districts, are in schools that have been placed under state control, which means that elected school boards are stripped of their power to control the school, and voters are denied the right to local governance of their schools. So again, we did this report last year, and it was a part of the commemoration of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which folks may know was the law aimed at overcoming legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote under the 15th Amendment in 1870. The act significantly widened the franchise and is considered among the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. What the takeover districts demonstrate, however, is a strategic and categorically racial or perhaps racist attempt to disenfranchise voters, particularly Black and brown voters. And when we look at right, so the evidence in terms of the racial impact is also clear when we look at where these districts tend to occur, that while we say these are state takeovers, they tend to happen in the urban centers of these states that, again, are predominantly representative of Black and brown folks. So in Louisiana, 63 of the recovery school districts are in New Orleans, only 12 are in Baton Rouge. In Tennessee, of the 29 schools in the Achievement School District, 29 are in Memphis, 2 are in Nashville. In Michigan, all 15 schools in the Education Achievement Authority are in Detroit. Again, predominantly Black cities where voters are essentially being stripped of their right to vote local people to control their school districts. Again, so this slide shows the actual racial demographics, right, that they are both stark and haunting. So of the number of schools seized by state takeover districts, 101, 89 of those have been converted to charters, and then a total of 47,596 students have been impacted. 97% of them are African American. So there is real evidence to suggest and to compel us again of the racist and racial implications of these takeovers, that they are happening primarily in communities of color, and that the real goal here, one, is to take schools away, but also to disenfranchise Black voters. And as far as the Alliance is concerned, that is rooted in a pathology or an idea that Black and brown folks are incapable of governing themselves. And whether or not the states would agree that, this is happening these are intentional sort of racist or racial laws, the fact is that their implication and the way they are played out are particularly racial. That again, the impact is 97% African-American families, African-American communities, African-American young people. And we cannot allow that to continue, primarily because of the racial implication, but also, as Kyle will get into, the impact is also severe, that when these districts are taken over, they are turned into charters, and those charters do not tend to serve the best interest of our communities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And now we'll pass it to Kyle Surratt with the Center for Popular Democracy.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Karan, for that great overview. So we wrote this report because we saw a bit of a pull in state legislatures to do this structural change, which follows folks making the argument that if we take your lowest performing schools, give them to us, get rid of your own local control, we will make them into the highest performing schools. Trust us. It's very much a structural change, not a strategic change argument. And the purpose of this report that you guys have in front of you is to debunk the argument that the academic changes and improvements will follow the structural changes. So if you are in a location that is fighting against the takeover of your schools, yes, there is one strong argument to say that do not take away local control from these communities, as Karan just demonstrated, 97% of which are African American. But there's got to be an accompanying argument in our view that when states take over low-performing schools, it does not work academically. And fortunately or unfortunately for us, we have many years of history inside of our country and the places that have done this to demonstrate the inefficacious model that is the achievement district. And you'll see in the chat section, I cut and paste a little section from our press release, which demonstrates that there's 9 states last year tried to do the achievement district model, and this year it's another 7, I believe. So despite what you'll hear from me is the poor academic showing of these strategies, and despite the fact that they take control from low-performing from communities, that still folks are going down this route. So let's look at the first one, Louisiana. Currently today, there's over 21,000 children that are in D and F rated charter schools. The state has spent over $700 million on the D and F rated schools. And when we did our study of Louisiana, we found that Louisiana has no system for helping a school get from an F to a D to a C to a B to an A. What they do have a record of doing is closing schools. So our take-home finding, the biggest finding we have, is that the state really that creates charter schools doesn't really have a mechanism for ensuring quality. And when they do get it wrong, when they thought they were authorizing an A-rated school, but instead they got an F-rated school, they have no mechanism for making those schools improve to get to the place where we want them. So they set high expectations for charter schools, but they never support them to get where they need to go. And just to look at this next chart, 42% of Louisiana's charters that were taken over in this achievement district model are rated D and F, and only 9% of children get to attend an A-rated school. So, and to be A-rated, it's just test scores, and we don't agree with that, you know, narrow definition of performance, but this is what we have to work with. But this is a situation where the schools that were F, D, C, they authorized those schools to be A's, but really they only got the A's only 9% of the time. So that's one thing as folks go to try to think about as they tout Louisiana and their system, point these facts out. You can go to our report and see this data. The other place, so the question is, all right, Louisiana, the first one, were they able to achieve the results? No. So let's go to Michigan. Michigan chose 15 Detroit schools. They're going to take over the lowest performing schools and improve them and make them better. And perhaps the most telling feature of whether it worked or not is the fact that the chancellor of their achievement program recently said 3 years into it, achievement hasn't improved. So again, this is what I think state lawmakers have confused the difference between structural change and strategic change. And over, you take over a bunch of schools, you change the structure into charter schools, and you expect to have a different outcome. It has not worked. So moving on to the next slide, if I can get it, good. So next is the Achievement School District in Nashville. And there was kind of a bit of media hype in this one, where they said, we're going to take the bottom 5% of your schools and we're going to bring them to the top 25%. And that was the promise. And that's what we usually find going into these arguments over achievement districts, is that there's this promise of dramatic change. And the need for dramatic change is not something that should be overlooked. It's just what is our strategy to achieve it is what we're really dialoguing about. Just recently, the person who was leading it, Chris Barbarick, resigned and said, you know, this taking the bottom 5% of schools and making to the top 25% using the strategy that we're using isn't going to work, and he resigned. The scores then did not improve. In some places they slipped in Nashville. Same for Michigan. The academic results were stagnant or declined in many instances. So you're looking at the three places that tried this. They forayed into it. They spent years, I think, probably working hard to try to achieve their promises, and each case were met with the same results. So if you are in a state that is facing this, please do use our report and these reports that we're talking about on this call, and debunk the theory that these strategies work for the children in these schools. It's much better to make an argument of strategic change than structural change. So I think that's the slides that I have here, and turn it over to Ken Zarefis.
Thanks so much. Yes. So we'll kick it off now to Ken, and you see on the opening slide for Ken, I'm glad the audio is working for you. Two reports that have recently come out. The first one from Annenberg and SES, which outlines community-driven strategies for strong public schools. And the second one from the Coalition for Community Schools, the Center for Popular Democracy and SES, which profiles schools, districts, and one entire state that are using the community schools strategy to turn struggling schools into thriving schools. So we invite you to check out both those reports. Ken is going to describe what this actually looks like in Austin. So I'll kick it to Ken now.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Catherine. Thank you all for being here. You know, Austin has had this experience that reaches back about 8-9 years. And before the term community schools even existed for us, we had a couple of schools that were closing. Both Webb Middle School and Reagan High School were in danger of closing, as slide says, in 2007 and then in 2008. Webb was the first one that was going to go down, and community partners, the school administration came together and said, we don't want our school to close. We're not going to let our school close. It's in the highest poverty, one of the most challenging areas of Austin. People came together and began, what they started to do was ask 3 fundamental questions of their community, their campus, their teachers. They said, what do you love about your schools, number 1? Number 2, what are the things that create barriers to your success? And then number 3, what are the resources you need to overcome those barriers? Those 3 basic questions led to the fact that there was an enormous amount of mobility. Attendance were severely hampering their ability to achieve the way the state required them to achieve. And so it was an all-out effort to help to circumvent those 2 concerns. By using the strategy of finding out what the problems are and addressing those, Webb, just by the hair of its teeth, was able to pass the test and get a reprieve, and they put together a plan that then said, we want to take this school and we want to move in the direction we see fit for our community. They created a plan that addressed attendance, mobility, the social needs. They developed a family resource center, and from very meager beginnings began to grow into what we now see 8 years later as a school that is performing at a tremendous level. The following year, Reagan High School, the high school, and y'all can move to the next slide. The high school that it fed into was going to be closed as well. So they contacted Webb and the folks, and those of us who were working at Webb, and said, what did you do? And we went through the same process. We were able to stop the closure for a year, began to put into place a program that addressed not just high school graduation, but college credit, a dual credit program. And 8 years later, 2 schools that were slated for closure that had dropped over 50% of its attendance had dropped from 1,400 to under 700 in high school, and from over 700 to under 350 in the middle school. Today, you have graduation rates from 48 that went from 48% to 50 to 85%. The early college high school at Reagan High School. What's really exciting about this, and you go to the school, this last year was the first full year of college credit seniors to go through. We have seniors that are graduating with 20, 30, 40, 50, and we have some seniors graduating with 60 college credits. And it's just transformed the community. And not only do they have the academics, which I want to stress is the focus of our community school effort here. To just have wraparound services certainly meets one of the very pressing needs of our neighborhoods and of our schools and our communities, but it's not enough. It must be a strong academic model so that the wraparound services support the kids to therefore achieve at a high academic level, to then begin to break that cycle of poverty, those challenges, those barriers that have kept them from moving forward. So the early college high school was wildly successful. The student mobility at Webb Middle School went from 35 to 25. And while still an enormous challenge at Webb, Webb has been able to move from closure to a campus that's the highest performing Title I campus in the district. Webb earned 5 state academic distinctions in 2013-14 and 3 in 14-15. The enrollment in both schools, I mentioned, had been cut in half through numerous challenges, and we all know that when a school starts to perform low on tests and on what was AYP, people begin to leave. And there were a number of challenges, but now I'm happy to say that they have both doubled in their size. People are coming back to the schools. They're attracted to the programs that are created in the schools. And Webb has just added World Cultures Academy and Innovation Academy to its academic model. So I'd like to move to the next slide. Our vision here in Austin has to reach beyond just 2 schools now. We want to see Austin become a community school district. We want this to be an option for all schools, particularly the schools that have the highest need, to see that this will help them to achieve their goals. In doing that, I reached out, applied to grants to the AFT and the NEA to support a feeder pattern or vertical team approach to this. We have the middle school, we have a high school, but what we really need is to have supports from the first day a child steps into our schools. The very first day in pre-K, all the way through 12th grade. So we got a grant that would support the Reagan vertical team, which is Reagan, Webb, and then 8 elementary schools in that vertical team, as well as another middle school. We are almost a year and a half into that project. We have 5 of the 8 elementary schools with plans. We have the 2nd middle school developing their plan. Webb has created their 2.0 plan. So we're seeing great success with that. In addition, my partner in this, Alan Weeks, who is the Executive Director of Austin Voices for Education and Youth. Austin Voices just received a Department of Education full-service community school grant for another vertical team in our district, Lanier High School, its middle school, Burnett Middle School, and 2 elementaries, Cook and Woolridge. It is a $2.5 million full-service community school grant. We are also reaching out. The grant itself lasts for 5 years, and we have to create supports to continue that work in both the Reagan feeder pattern and the Lanier feeder pattern after the grant periods. To do that, we've reached out to the City of Austin, the mayor, to support through resources and invest in community schools, and the same with our Travis County partners in Health and Human Services and the courts. The city is on the verge of developing its educational plan wrapped within the community school model. Travis County is joining us in Albuquerque. They are looking at how they can apply some of their meager resources in Health and Human Services into programs that they see as working. We also see this as a huge opportunity to work with the courts, with the youth, and to begin to address the school-to-prison pipeline through restorative practices, as well as a relationship with the court. Let's go to the next slide. Our large vision is to create a community school district, to see that all schools have this opportunity, that this is sustainable, and that we can create the schools that all our children deserve. What we want to do as well is working at the local level. We know we have to work at the state level. In the last legislative session, we meet once every 2 years. In 2015, House Bill 1891 was our community school bill. We worked very hard with Austin Voices. As all of you probably well know, we're a very conservative state with a lot of troubling political realities. Even in that environment, we were able to create a bill that went unanimously out of House committee, was sponsored by Republicans and Democrats, was fully supported in the House on the floor, went to the Senate, was voted out of the Senate committee, and then was going to the floor. We had the votes on the floor, but the Lieutenant Governor would not release it to a vote on the floor. It was political gaming. It was very disappointing. But what we are very hopeful of is that not only did we get the bill almost passed, we changed the narrative at the State House. People know what community schools are. They talk about community schools. They talk about wraparound services and strong academics. So we begin to change the language. And what we were able to do with one of the chair of the House Education Committee, a Republican friend of ours, he was able to actually insert the language from the community school bill, some of the language, into an innovation district law, House Bill 1842, that on one side is very scary for us because it can open the door to allow districts to have freedom from state code and requirements and open the door for charters. But what it can also do, it does require community engagement, community involvement, and allows us an opportunity to create community school districts, an opportunity to step in the door and to change, turn around to, rather than a closure and sell our schools off and our districts off to charters, but to where we have ownership, that we can do the things that we know that has been successful through Webb and Reagan throughout our district. So we see this, while a troubling bill, also a great opportunity. I'd like to move to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess that's the last slide. One of the things that I want to stress here is we also have a relationship with the Texas Education Agency. And I'll leave this, my last comments, in that we work very hard to have strong communications with all of our partners. Even the ones that we don't think are friendly. To think that we're working with Republicans at the level we are now would have been unheard of a decade ago. We can't burn bridges. We have to have strong communications to build good relationships so that we can have outcomes like we're starting to see in our district. We've built a relationship with the Texas Education Agency where Austin Voices for Education and Youth are going to be a key player in helping districts to navigate community schools within this innovation district bill. So we have a very hopeful future. But we have to keep up the relationships. We have to continue to communicate even in a hostile environment like Texas. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ken. That stands, I think, in stark contrast to the academic outcomes that Kyle just spoke to, and I think really resonated with our attendees because we have a lot of questions about the community schools model. Micah, can you go to the next slide? So before we go to Q&A, I just want to invite you guys to one resource which we'll also share by email. The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools has created this really useful infographic that summarizes the three reports that are discussed on this webinar, the ARROS report, the report from Center for Popular Democracy, and the Community Schools Approach. You can find that at reclaimOurSchools.org/resources. So I'll open it up now to questions and answers. I've got a couple that were sent to us in the chat box here. I'll ask Karan. I'll send Karan this question first. The question is from, I think, Lally Lloyd. Sorry if that's a mispronunciation. I lead a network of congregations that partner with public schools in order to advocate for quality schools for all children. What role can local faith communities play in the effort to, 1, resist statewide achievement districts, and 2, support growth of community schools? Any of our panelists should feel free to jump in, but we'll pass to Karan first.
So I think there is a moral, whenever we get into these questions around race, around community leadership, I do think there is a moral question that I think faith communities are in a position to respond to and articulate in compelling ways. I also think that when we think about mobilizing to take action and putting bodies in the streets or in the State House to lift up a particular vision, I also think that faith communities are uniquely positioned to do that. And so those two things together provide real opportunity for local faith communities to be engaged. The ARROS model is to build local coalitions that invite, at the local level, any formation of groups that are interested in supporting public education and particularly lifting up the sustainable community schools model. And at the national level, for example, we have Gamaliel, which is a network of faith communities and faith organizations that is a part of ARROS, and so we welcome the participation of faith communities again, because they bring sort of a moral frame into the issue, and they have the capacity to mobilize people on the local levels in quick and powerful ways. So I think that is welcome, and those are two ways to support the work.
Thanks so much, Karan. And a reminder that if you want to ask a question verbally, there's the raise a hand function above chat. You can click that and we will go through and unmute you as we're also filtering through some of these questions we've gotten in the chat box. This question might be good for Lee or for Kyle. Lee has worked on many of these reports, is on the line as well. Several people have asked about state takeovers that might look a little different than the ones that we discussed on this report. So Larry Leverett asked about what about New Jersey, Newark, Camden, Patterson, Jersey City. We've got a question about in Little Rock, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the district was taken over by the state last year. 40% of schools have a D or F grade. Do Kyle or Lee, you want to address sort of the distinction of the districts that we're talking about here today?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think it's just in terms of like how they like structuring themselves. So when we talk of these achievement districts, there's one where they create a whole new district, and that's where they kind of pile all the schools into. And then there's this other mechanism where they take over a district and convert their schools to charters, or they take over a number of districts and they turn them into charters. I think that like both of those mechanisms are in vogue, and what you'll find is like we have 6,700 charter schools in our country, and 2,800 of those schools have of total charter schools that have existed have closed, which means that when authorizers create these schools, they get it wrong a lot of the time. So it's not only in these like takeover districts where they create a new authority, or whether they take over a district like in Newark or beyond, or Little Rock, that they get it wrong. It's just kind of we just have some poor metrics in place, and the wrong skills are in places for authorizers to create these schools. So there's a lot of different ways that things are taken over, but we kind of pointed our report towards this trend that we saw of creating a whole new district and pulling schools out from existing districts into these new mechanisms.
Thanks, Kyle. So another question just about these state takeovers and the evidence from our reports is how this has been communicated to national media. And a similar question, how do you confront conversations about choice and the role of charter schools for communities who haven't been served well by the local school districts? I'll pass this to Lee.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to make a couple of points since the issue of choice has been brought up, and also to add on to what Kyle was saying. One of the reasons that we have focused on this particular mechanism where a state school district is created and then schools are lifted out of their local district and placed in the state district, one of the reasons we focused on that is that it does seem to be a strategy that is being promoted, studied, and advocated for by the charter industry. This is also true in some of the newer cases of whole district takeovers, as in Little Rock. Remember, after they took over the Little Rock School District, there was an effort to pass a bill in the legislature that would allow for the first time districts that had been taken over to be turned over to charter schools. So I do think there is a move here by the charter industry to use takeovers for the purpose of wholesale chartering. And a couple of things to be aware of if you are in a state that's considering one of these bills. One is that the enabling legislation often sets a specific test score bar for eligibility into the district. So schools with scores below X are eligible for the district. But in New Orleans, as an example, in 2003, when the Recovery School District was created, only 3 schools in the state were taken over by that district. But after Hurricane Katrina, the legislature very easily, with a sweep of a pen, raised the cut score, which allowed them to take over all but 5 schools in the city of New Orleans. So that cut score that they're determining can be very easily changed. And secondly, all of these bills promise multiple intervention options for the schools. For example, in the Opportunity School District in Georgia, the enabling legislation says that the schools would be directly managed by the state or could use joint management between the state and the local school district. They could be converted to a charter school or they could be closed. So 4 different options and a timeline for returning the schools back to the local district after the intervention. But we actually dug out an application that the state of Georgia sent into the federal government for federal funding. And in that application, and this was after the OSD legislation had passed, in that legislation, the state says that all 20 schools that would be taken over each year would be converted to charters, and asked for funding from the federal government to charterize all 20 schools. So they never intended, it appears, to use the other strategies that they mentioned. So one question for all of you, and I hope this is responding to the question that you had. If you're in a state that's considering one of these takeovers, one question is, take a look at the quality and the characteristics of the existing charter schools in the state, because it is likely that the strongest option or the most pushed option in your state, if the takeover goes through, is some kind of transformation of the schools to charters. And so if the charters in your state are performing well and the authorizers seem to be doing a good job, that's one thing. If that's not the case, then it's another thing.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. So we have a number of questions about the community schools model. And so I'll pass a couple over to Ken, but any of our panelists who are working on community schools should feel free to jump in. The first is from Paige McCullough. Hi, Paige, in North Carolina. Ken, could you give a little more detail on how teachers gain skills and stronger instruction in the schools that you referenced in your presentation?
Go back again and emphasize the fact that...
Sorry, Ken, I think you were muted. Can you start from the beginning?
Okay. Yeah, sure. I do want to emphasize that we see community schools as an academic, a transformational academic model. And it's really important to keep academics focused, because one of the things that we've discovered is that our opponents will try to paint us into a corner of a social service provider and say that that is not the duty of public schools. Now, we know that providing support for kids that come into it with less support is a responsibility of schools, but it's something that I just want to stress again. This is about academics, so the question is really important. And so you have to have teachers involved from the beginning. This cannot be another model. We talk a lot about it's a process, not a product. We have a number of products that all kinds of districts across this country are taking off of the shelf and trying to plug into a school and a neighborhood and a community and say this is what's going to fix this. We see it in New Orleans, we just see it all over the country. You've heard about it today. It's important that we look at this as a process of asking questions and understanding what the needs of the neighborhood, of the school, and our children are is paramount to finding success in the classroom. and teachers must be part of that discussion. If we operate solely on the basis of we're going to have, this is a great academic program, we think this is wonderful, but it's coming from someone outside that viewed a program that they saw at a workshop, or a superintendent that heard about it that wants to just implement it, it's doomed for failure. You have to have teachers at the beginning talking about what their needs are in the classroom and talk about what they're willing to do. It goes back to those questions. What do you love about your schools? What are the barriers to success? And what resources do we need? And that means your own individual resource to be successful. And when we find that, and when we continue to talk about that, bringing a group of teachers together to continue to engage with your faculty at a campus, but you can also look at how you deal with this at a district level. But you have to start on a campus. When teachers have that involvement, they have ownership. And I taught for 12 years at eighth grade language arts teaching. I saw programs, as we all have, come and go. It's the program of the year. We know that if we just hunker down and just bury our head, that program will pass like every other program, and another one will come back next year, and we can just teach in our classroom. And that just doesn't work. We have to figure out how teachers can be the drivers of programs and academic achievement.
Thanks, Ken. Another question on the community schools model from Nita Rudy. Hi, Nita, in Mississippi, is whether this model has been seen in rural communities. Nita, I invite you to check out the community schools report that I referenced before Ken started speaking, which can be found on the Center for Popular Democracy's website on your screen, or SES, because one of the community schools models it profiles is the Kentucky model, a statewide model that was enacted in 1990 that uses school-based centers to provide wraparound supports to students and their families, and operates all over the state of Kentucky, including rural communities in the state. But Ken or other panelists might have some other examples to share.
No, I think that's a really valid question. I grew up in a small community of 8,000 people, and some of the attributes of community schools is what I grew up around, because the community is such an integral part of the school, and the school is the community. There's little barrier between the two. It's a very porous flow, and your identity as a small town is oftentimes based on your high school, your schools, your small elementaries. Here in Texas, there is an effort to work with, there's actually a community school organization that works with rural communities, and their focus is rural communities. I've been on a couple of calls in West Virginia on how to utilize community school model in poor rural communities. And this is something we can't forget, because so many of our rural communities are struggling as mightily as some of our urbans, and we can't leave them behind. We have to figure out, how do we adjust this to address their needs? What we have found in Texas is many of the things that a decade ago we wouldn't have thought about this relationship with Republicans, but local control is a big issue in Texas. And we have found partnerships with a lot of folks by saying, let us do what we want to do, what we know what is best for our community. Let us truly have local control that just doesn't stop at the administration level of a local district, but let's let it seep down into our community. And that's a rural community or an urban community. And we have found relationships with rural Republicans that has actually pushed back on this, on many of these home rule districts and these charterizing of our larger urbans, because the rural Republicans do not want to lose their own local control, and they don't see this takeover as local control law, but a state mandate that they won't have anything to do with.
So I have one thing I'd add to it. This is Kyle Surratt with the Center for Popular Democracy. So how you do the community school strategy is contingent on what the results you have. So in this report that we're referencing on this webinar, we're highlighting transformational community schools that have had transformational results, such as the Webb and Reagan Middle School. And there's 5,000 community schools in our country, and some provide just wraparound supports, or they do one of a few elements of community schools. But if you have a struggling school, and you want to transform where it's at, there's a very specific strategy to use in order to achieve that. And it will be achievable in your rural areas or in your urban settings. It doesn't really matter. It's because, as Ken mentioned, it's a strategy and that's research-backed. So really urge you to kind of look to our report because it identifies the key elements of the community school strategy that are necessary to be in place in order to achieve transformation.
Thanks.
And this is Karan.
Oh, yep.
This is Karan from Arrow. So one of the things I will say, and I say this in most places where I talk about community schools, in any room I've been in where I've said to parents and teachers and students, what does a good school look like? Without going to our website, without reading our pamphlets, the elements of sustainable community schools are the very things they talk about, right? And they may add one or may not refer to they may be missing one or add an additional component. But the idea here is that this is not, while it is an effective strategy, it should not be seen or observed or taken as rocket science, as something that is, purely innovative, something miraculous. It is, as G2 Brown from Arrows often says, it's the schools that folks in, wealthy, prioritized communities have, right, where it is a fact that what happens outside of the classroom impacts learning, and so we build schools that address that, a focus on curriculum that is rich and rigorous, parent and community engagement. These are not novel ideas. They are necessary, but they should not be perceived as, oh, this is some new thing that these folks over here made up. But it is looking at, as Kyle said, what is working, what has worked, and saying this is what a good school looks like. And again, when you ask people outside of any presentation on community schools what they think good schools should look like, these are the very elements that they lift up.
Thanks, Karan. A question going back to the state takeover issue from Jeff Bryant. Under the new ESSA federal legislation, states are required to identify the lowest performing 5% of schools every 3 years based on the state's individual accountability system. Is this something that will possibly increase proliferation of state takeover agencies? Any of our panelists want to take that?
This is Kyle. So I don't think it will necessarily lead to it, but I think that we have to organize really well at this point because we know that under ESEA we found that when left to its own devices, states will come up with weird new ideas, such as these achievement districts to take over schools and believe it'll lead to great results despite no research demonstrating that it will work. So I think my answer to the question is more of how do we outcompete these other ideas in the school improvement space so that when our lawmakers, who generally only have 2 years of experience, are looking for strategies for these 5% schools, what they hear is community schools. What they hear is a research-backed model that has worked in whether it's a rural community or urban community or communities in between, and that they see the data right up close. So I think that's my best answer for you, Jeff, is that we're going to have to put on our organizing shoes and make sure that folks understand models that work for these 5% schools.
Catherine, Catherine?
Yes.
Hey,
Hi.
Hi, this is Kent. I'd like to just add just briefly to that. I think that one of the things that we oftentimes operate out of, and I know Webb and Reagan were born out of crisis. And in crisis, when you say you're going to close the school down, you will get enormous involvement and people coming out to support that. What we have to start learning how to operate in is an environment of need. If schools are in need of this, and we know that, we don't have the luxury of waiting for crisis to occur for us to act. And it's really important that we take steps to act. We find out who can help move this agenda at state, local, and district level. We don't care anymore whether a person has an R or a D after their name at the legislature. We couldn't care less. If they're willing to look at community schools, and we found that community schools were largely supported by Republicans in this very, very conservative state, we need to pursue that, even if they're carrying bills that we can't stand. And if we just judge individuals solely on some other issues, or even within education, that they may be doing things, and refuse to engage in a way that continues to try to get our agenda and to get this thoughtful process community schools in, then we miss an opportunity in what's a very conservative environment, and increasingly so, unfortunately. So I think it's really important that we look at how do we operate from a perspective of need instead of crisis, and that demands that we act now and we start building relationships now.
Okay, thanks. Lee, I'm going to pass it to you to make a final comment on ESSA. We're getting a ton of questions, which is super exciting, but we only have an hour for this webinar, so I'm going to invite you to email any of our panelists. They've provided their email addresses, and they're on the screen in front of you with all of your questions, because we'd love to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I'll be really brief. I just wanted to respond to Jeff's question. Excuse me. So we have been trying to monitor the charter industry and charter support organizations, and yes, they are absolutely talking about using ESSA and the turnaround requirements, the bottom 5% of schools, to charterize more schools. There are conversations going on, but it's really important to know that under ESSA, unlike No Child Left Behind, local districts now control the intervention model that's going to be used in their district. And so we've got a huge opportunity here to press our local districts and our states to choose sustainable community schools as their intervention. And it does require, as Ken said, that we get in there now and we start talking about it, because, yes, the charter industry is absolutely looking at this as an opportunity as well.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks to all of our panelists, Karan and Kyle and Ken, and to all of our attendees for joining us. We're really excited that you guys have so many questions, and like I said, we'd love to continue the conversation. So please reach out to us, and I will follow up with the recording of this webinar and the resources that we've discussed during this hour. Thanks again for joining us, and talk to you guys soon. Thanks.
Thank you.